So in these three panels, we are not discussing any specific rocket scientists or what they did or did not do. We are simply providing the stories of children, of team members, and what their lives were like growing up. So the topic for our first session in early August touched on America's early rocket history by the sharing of stories of 4 children, and I see Gisela right back there, she was one of them, who arrived at Fort Bliss. And they told their stories from the time period 1946 to 1950. Then last time we had, we're gonna be,
Bumblebee.
we told stories of resourcefulness, and we ended up, and Jürgen was on that panel, we ended up with some fun stories about Christmas, which has even led to another gathering that will be held later with the Marshall Retirees Association. So, a little background. At the end of World War II, in 1945, the U.S. government had sought to gain the technological advances from Germany by securing the top scientists, engineers, doctors, professors, and the foremost in their fields of endeavor.
It's right on.
Oh dear, okay. Camera hog, right? I don't think so, it's a bumblebee. It's the hero of the day, all right. So Operation Paperclip lasted from 1945 to 1970, under which about 127 rocket specialists, plus their families who'd been kept confined for 4 to 5 years at Fort Bliss, and the U.S. government decided that they would not send the scientists and families back to Germany, but instead would allow them to legally immigrate and move on to Huntsville, Alabama, and to Redstone Arsenal to begin work in earnest on rocket development. The Cold War was looming. So now for today's panel, and this is actually a spin-off from Ed Buckby's book, The Greatest Space Generation, in the back of which he had some little excerpts from children, in quotes, of rocket team members and what it was like growing up with a rocket scientist. So that's the theme of today, what it was like growing up with a rocket scientist. Time frame is 1950 to 1960. And I know these first 3 here, and I'll give the names in just a moment, but the first 3 get together regularly for lunch and have wonderful memories that they share at that point. So, and then Uwe Rothe, at the end here, he has joined us. We have not seen him for quite some time, so we get to hear his stories too. But I'll introduce each one a little bit more. And first, well, let's say, here we've got Rainer Klaus, Peter Finzel, George von Tiesenhausen, and Uwe Rothe. Okay, so first we'll have Rainer. And Rainer retired as a librarian from the area library, from an area library in Atlanta several years ago to move back to the local area to help take care of family. He and his wife, Gudrun, who is also, I think they're the only married couple. I have heard there might be one other, but I believe they're the only married couple of children from the German team. So Gudrun Wagner Klaus and Rainer Klaus. And the highlight of their life right now is a new grandson, Otto. They have a son, Lucas, and his wife, but highlight is grandson, Otto. So with that, we'll let Rainer Klaus take it away.
Good afternoon. I wonder how many old Huntsvillians I have going back to 1950s, 60s here. A few of you. Okay, doesn't matter. I graduated from Lee High School in 1964. I was a member of the first graduating class. Then we got to be a triumvirate of 3 high schools in Huntsville: Butler, Lee, and Huntsville High. In the early 2000s, the editor of our school newspaper began putting out started a website, which sort of became a weekend newsletter for Lee High School graduates. It became sort of a clearinghouse for people who had not been in touch since the middle 60s. So it got a lot of us back in touch again. We also shared a lot of memories, things going on in our lives, that sort of thing. I began writing memoir pieces for it. First I wrote about my days at Risen, my days at Lee High School, my days at Lee Junior High. Then I began writing about just general events in my life. And what I'm going to read today are two segments that have to do with me being a German American. Pictures should be cycling through here. I'm going to be referring to two of the pictures. I'm not sure if they're going to get to. Peter and I are in that picture there. I should add that Peter and I were on the same boat coming over to the United States in 1947. Anyway, I'll get started. The first one is called The Three R's, Reiner, Rolf, and Reinhard. John, you'll see Reinhard. No reading, writing, or arithmetic for us yet, though. Those would come several years later in Huntsville. The three little German boys are developing their fine motor skills this day in 1948 in our kindergarten in Fort Bliss, Texas. Rolf and Reinhard, who were just about 6 months to a year older than me, are on task, applying polish and brushing their sandals. I, on the other hand, seem to be caught in reverie, looking down at the sandal I'm swaddling in my lap. Was I puzzling out what to do? I have few memories of this schooling. It's fortunate that someone, perhaps the teacher who minded us or a parent who wanted to document our activities, captured this particular moment. Without it, I wouldn't have a record for the beginning of my education and those early days of those friendships. The picture is a study in contrast. The room's walls are blemished and battered. Our feet rest on a plain wooden floor, probably close in color to the brown walls around us. A scuffed up soft drink case serves cleverly as a makeshift support for a checkered square and the tray for polished brushes and cloths. In such an austere setting, we form a crescent of vividness. The pristine aprons protect our clothes from an accidental swipe of polish by hands that are just beginning to become dexterous. We're a crescendo of stripes, bold, bolder, and boldest. Were striped shirt part of the uniform for boys then? That must have been cheap and fitting wear for a nation of what were to become rough and ready baby boomers. I have about a dozen pictures from 1948 to 55 featuring me and my brothers dressed in such shirts. The chairs we're sitting on, decorated with Mexican floral motifs, added fanciful elements of color and decorative flair, enlivening the plain surroundings. Picking up the white of our aprons and shirts, the iconic soft drink case completes the composition. For this moment, there are three serious little German boys. We had numerous classmates, boys and girls who were born near the war's end with us. Besides polishing sandals and shoes, which promoted hand-eye coordination, neatness, and personal responsibility, must have engaged in imaginative and playful activities designed to nurture and further our individual and social growth in this Texas garden of children. All of that happened as we were still mastering our mother tongue. I know that I can't claim, as Robert Fulgham humorously did in his short book several years ago, that all I needed to know I learned in kindergarten. It was a bit more complicated for us, so much more followed. The kindergarten classrooms were in the complex of buildings that comprised our compound, a large group of former outbuildings of the William Beaumont General Hospital. According to Wikipedia, during World War II, William Beaumont General Hospital expanded to include 174 buildings and a crowded 4,064 beds, as the hospital began providing specialized medical care to wounded soldiers returning from theaters all over the world. During early 1945, approximately 6,000 inpatients were treated. A year after the war ended, some of the outbuildings were converted to apartments, offices, laboratories, and community activity buildings for the new German residents. This repurposing of buildings is one of the ironies of the time. The friendship of the three R's began in kindergarten and has continued for many years and in many ways. Reinhardt and I walked to kindergarten together. Shortly before the mass move of the Germans and American personnel to Huntsville in 1950, in an exchange devised by our mothers, who had witnessed our growing friendship, Reinhardt and I gave each other small gifts. I think a small car and candy were exchanged. Maybe our mothers were thinking, who knows what's going to happen in Huntsville? Maybe these boys will never see each other again.
I'm going to interrupt just a moment because the Klaus family, your family, is right behind you.
Oh, that's
You're
my,
on the right
okay, yes.
of the picture.
My brother Dieter, my younger brother Gunnar, and my mother and father. Anyway, Reinhardt and I made contact. It wasn't, we weren't lost forever. Rolf and I were playmates at Longwood Court, the apartment complex that was our first residence in Huntsville, and later at our homes in Darwin Downs or on Montesano. His parents were subscribers to National Geographic magazine. And in the 1950s, that was the best magazine in the world. We and other German families often gathered at their house and vice versa for the Sunday social ritual of coffee and kuchen, coffee and cake. And I would snatch time to riffle through those magazines when we were stuffing ourselves with Coke and cake. I can still remember the cicadas singing in the summer nights when we drove home from the mountain down Bankhead Parkway with the windows open after a fun-filled visit on Panorama Drive. Reinhardt and I were in the same Boy Scout troop, so were Peter and I. The three of us were reunited for 2 years of catechism classes and then confirmation at St. Mark's Lutheran Church in 1959. Reinhardt and I played dozens and dozens of tennis games at Huntsville High School and the courts on California Street. I attended their weddings. I lost touch with Rolf for years, but reconnected with him after I wrote this short memoir piece. Reinhardt and I have maintained our friendship for many years. This is called Paradise on the Tennessee River. Asawintha, a Cherokee word that means the place where the Germans gathered to swim. Maybe creek, I don't know. That would make sense. I don't know who discovered it, but the news got around, and in the early 1950s, a group of Huntsville German families began spending their Sundays at this rustic resort fishing camp off Highway 79 between Gunnersville and Scottsboro. There amongst the pines beside the Tennessee River, one found a main office, a few cabins to rent, a swimming pier, a small mud sand beach, a boat dock with gasoline pump, and ample room for kids to frolic and parents to set up camp and socialize. Preparations began Saturday evening when my mother would fry hamburgers, make potato salad, and organize the other provisions. After we had a light breakfast on Sunday morning, a tray of the big red Coca-Cola cooler would be packed with food, and a block of ice would be placed in the bottom compartment, along with Cokes, Dr. Pepper's, coffee, and beer. Then we'd head up Bankwood Parkway in our jade green 51 Mercury, the trunk stuffed with camp chairs, blankets, inner tubes, and food. In those days, you had to drive through New Hope on the old Highway 431 to get to Highway 79. Once we passed a turnoff to Gunnersville Dam, we knew the destination wasn't far away. Upon arrival, the Klaus kids piled out of the car, looked for their friends, and helped set up the family's encampment. Dad went to the office to pay the fee for the day. When that was taken care of, you got the green light to go have fun. I remember the river bottom being firm and kind of pebbly near the swimming pier, where I spent most of my time. Out at the far end of the pier, which stretched about 10 yards, the water was about 12 feet deep, 2 fathoms of pretty clear water. The accompanying picture shows my mother, brother Dieter, who was 6 years older, and me having fun on our inner tubes. It looks like I'm about 7, so this picture was probably snapped in 1953. Dieter was ready to cross the Tennessee in his inventive watercraft. Though it interrupted our water play, the break for lunch was always welcome. Time to devour that picnic food. Some families might set up for a weenie roast or other grilled food, but I found my mother's cold burgers delicious. Their dressings of chilled tomatoes, onions, mustard, ketchup, lettuce, and mayo were a piquant delight. Cheeseburgers were a later discovery. There are many types of German potato salad, hot, cold, variations within variations. My mom made hers with mustard base, so it was tangy. A sugary, ice-cold Coca-Cola was a perfect complement to such an international meal. Chips and pastry treats, some homemade, completed the requirements for the picnic food pyramid. After we finished eating and then waited the requisite hours so that our food could digest, and we wouldn't get cramps, thrash, and drown in several seconds, within clear sight of our parents, the afternoon brought a mixture of aquatic and dry land activities, more swimming, diving, and pushing each other off the dock, voyages on inner tubes, card games, board games, or just running around under the trees. All in all, an idyllic day for everyone. I can't remember how many years we flocked back there in the summer, but probably not much past the mid-50s. By then, some of the German families had gone on to another stage of the American dream and assimilation and bought boats or water lots on the lakes and rivers of the Tennessee Valley. My parents may have considered such acquisition, but decided against them. For one thing, we had recently moved into a new house. Because my father and older brother had spent a lot of time building a garage and making modifications to our house, I don't think he wanted to get involved with clearing brush and trees or other construction projects out in the boonies, no matter how appealing and tranquil that might be. Instead, we were often the guests of our friends at their properties on the Tennessee and Elk Rivers, Gunnersville Lake and Whitaker Lake. Or we cruised on those bodies of water in their boats. That was all pleasurable, but something was missing, the communal joy and free spirits, the more ample Gemütlichkeit of those early days at Asawintha. As of 2 years ago, I wrote this in 2008, 2 years after my wife and I had returned to Huntsville from 30 years of living in the Atlanta area, Gudrun, her mother, and I drove out there on a sentimental journey to stop at Gunnersville Dam and see if our old swimming hole up the road was still open. After so many years away, we were surprised to see that it still existed. The cabins were there, the central office too, but there were lots of small trailers on blocks, aging recreational vehicles and camper trucks scattered around. So it had become mostly a retirement spot beside the milfoil choked river. The path to the swimming pier was blocked and overgrown with weeds, and the pier itself was a derelict.
Asawintha and family on the back.
Missing lots of boards. We had brought a few sandwiches, no hamburgers this time, and sitting in the car, we looked out across the river, remembering. That's it.
Moving back in time, did you feel that? I could taste some of your things that you referenced, so. Are we?
I'll let you use this again.
All right, here we go. Now, next we have Peter Fensel, who has been a longtime family friend. He appears in several of the pictures too as a young child, so we've known each other ever since we were small children. Peter and his wife, Peter first was an engineer, and he retired a few years ago from the U.S. Army here at Redstone Arsenal. And along the way, he earned his PhD. Peter and his wife, Ginger, have 3 children, and I believe it's 8 grandchildren, am I correct? 8, okay. Both have been tireless supporters of the Huntsville community, and I bet some of you know Ginger too. And sadly, Ginger has Parkinson's disease and is now bedridden, so please keep her in your prayers. So, fortunate that we could have Peter here with us today. Thank you for coming, and Peter Fensel.
Thank you.
You need this.
Yeah, when I was thinking about this, I'm not a big storyteller like Reiner is, but I wanted to tell you some stories about what it was like, growing up here in Huntsville. And first of all, from my perspective, me as an individual, and then some stories from my parents' perspective, which was kind of interesting too. Like Reiner, I was born in Germany, and we came over and we were on the same boat together, and I've got pictures of us playing in the playpen, so it's really kind of cool. so we came over in 47. That's the first time I saw my father was in May of 1947. And of course then I don't remember anything about Fort Bliss. Reiner seemed to have more memories than I do of that area. Most of my early memories started in Huntsville. And we came to Huntsville in May of 1950. Now, I started school in 1952, and I have been racking my brain trying to remember how I would have dealt with the language problem, because as far as I know, I only spoke German at home. And how did I do when I first, I didn't go to kindergarten. How did I do when I went to first grade? I don't know. But I seemed to be okay, because I remember it as I had a lot of friends. I went through the whole school system. Now, unlike Reiner, I didn't go to Ryerson. My parents wanted us to go to East Clinton. And back then in the early 50s, you could pay extra to have your kids go to whatever school you wanted to. And so I
went to East Clinton too.
You did? Okay. Anyway, where we lived at the time, our parents hired a taxi service where a taxi would pick us up every morning, take us to East Clinton. Where we lived was over there close to where Alabama A&M is today. And so it would take us to East Clinton and then pick us up in the afternoon and bring us home. Later on we moved, and I ended up at the Blossomwood School, and Huntsville Junior High School, and Huntsville High School. But I don't remember any conflict with my fellow students that were Americans. I remember having lots of friends that were Americans, not just my German buddies. Maybe a couple of times I had gotten into a fight with somebody, and the guy would say, "Why don't you go back to Germany?" You know, just this kind of thing. But generally, it was a pretty pleasant experience. I was gonna forward a little bit. I ended up marrying Ginger Fenzel, Ginger Hockensnyder, in 1968. And what's significant about that is her father was an American GI that was in a German POW camp for 2.5 years and managed to survive it. And I was always surprised that he was not bitter about the fact that I was German, you know. But he always said the Germans didn't treat them any worse than they treated, you know, their own people. So I don't know. One other comment I was going to make. Heidi said that I had worked for the United States Army. I was a software engineer involved in missile testing, and I spent a lot of years out at White Sands Missile Range. And we fired all of our missiles from Launch Complex 33, which is the old von Braun launch complex. It's interesting, it's got the plaque there for von Braun. So it was, and because I had done it for so many years over different periods of time, I had my wife Ginger there for missile tests. I've had at least 2 of my kids there for missile tests. So anyway, okay, that pretty much finishes myself. As far as my parents were concerned, when they were at Fort Bliss, it was nice because they were finally safe from the effects of the war. They lived in a community with other Germans. They were kind of an insulated community. I know we've had other talks where people talked about the disadvantages, but there were a lot of advantages to living in a German community like that. But when they came to Huntsville, it was a pretty harsh acclimation. The worst thing was the climate, I know, especially for my mother. Both of my parents were from the eastern parts of Germany, grew up in areas that were pretty cold climates, and